The proud walls of Confederate and steel collapse under fire and steel. The proud wall and their tabs under fires and snapples, and Seftamoven foul to Ketterfield words Canestu, finer stanton core walls of Constantinople, collapse walls of these, and the spirit of war over the hydrant. The collapse under fire and steel, under fire and sea. Proud, constant, collapse under fire and steel. The proud wall ass under fire and steel. Pick up the under fire and um seal and 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 the proud walls under fire and steel will collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople or Zmiesforfrein, Bointrant, Dalbrief, collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople, under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople, the proud walls of Constantinople collapse of fire and steel. Hubs under fire, fan steel. The proud walls of Stenter to within steam thrill. And that's the worst those teen days. The proud will lapse under fire and steel. And understand that it's dimed anonymally Aries F under fire and steel the collapse and have in her hands and the proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople, Kleider Fapstarians. Farm pride walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Those or the proud will lapse under fire and steel, and steel, staple but collapse as under fire and hey, the hay collapse under fire and steel. Peak and hoe. The proud will lapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople collire and steel. Irkanof I zeal condured a fire and airs. And announced free itstens t'other air its down. The prolapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of fire and steel. A fire Constantinople, Kyre, Audi. Fee. That's under fire. Seal. The proud walls of Comp's iron under fire and steel. Constantinople. And still under fire and steel. Your streets and esteem. The proud walks under fire and steel. Constantinople collapse under and steel. Under fire and steel. Canopal collapse under fire and steel. Cave, the proud will lapse under fire and steel. Detail, fire and steel. Amount fire and steel. Interest in a hole and offer sea prism. Proud walls of Constantinople. An opal collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople, half honor and this utter fills of conyers of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Connor 3. If Constantinople collapsed under fire and steel, collapse under fire, and stay on a tether and a fire day. The proud walls under fire and steel, and collapse or bees. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. collapse under fire and steel. Higher and says, the proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. And steel. The eyes proud walls unto Apples and Dick to others, worst walls are feared over and it's lying on the walls and under and the proud walls under fire and steel. And steel under collapse. Constantinople collapse and force and under fire and steel. And advise under fire and steel. A 108. 108. Collapse under fire and steel. Be close C. And helps him collapse under fire and steel. Collapse under fire and steel. And our and comes from wads under alls and stees. Collapse under fire and steel. Steel. The proud walls under fire, ire, and steel. Collapse under fire and steel. Seen and now there's implier enter stee. Superlapse to pray. The proud walls under fire and steel. The prod collapse under fire and steel. So can steeple. Cog collapse under fire and steel. Parlamaseer and steel. Vi. N. A. The proud waff av Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Steels and there shall amount tally fire wished and enter a steel. So only as there's wars of Constantinople under fire and steel. Collapse under fire and steel. And 3. Fire. D. The proud walls of Constantinople enough lapse under fire and steel. The proud wall lapse under fire and steel. Collapse it's fire and steel. They Constantinople collapse. Wonder Vizid as the proud walls under fire and steel. Yeah. The Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. They pray as constitution and hold what they and ten of it of their pieces chemster know that you do. Whoa. The proud walks under fire and steel collapse of under fire and a steel preserve at Brett. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Fire collapse under fire and steel. But assassin parent is this the Telebes? The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. As the brothers under fire and Shinobi era Ford stage and steel fruit. The proud walls under fire and steel. Collapse under fire and steel. The fum ace tie under fire and steel. The proud walls of constant iron and steel. The of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Shos under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Avial, Absteer, fire and steel. Is under fire and seer freer. If not as a collapse under fire and steel. If and bis A. The proud one collapse under fire and steel.
The kind of it. Oh.
The pot was one more fired. Hey. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Under fire and steel. Thy fire, air. Walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Hey, collapse under fire and steel and tamer. Pure. Under fire and steel. The proud walls under fire and steel collapse under fire and steel. A conflair Ifrid unsustained kleiner. Vin of Thotels, Kermver and de Vrigo Ozier. Fee. The prouder fire and steel. And liar. The proud walls of Constantinople a fample collapse under fire and steel. The collapse under fire and steel. So the fire and hence Yov Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. This plain. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel of whence interdictus and Pomerante. Proud walls of Constantinople people collapse under fire and steel. The proud will lapse under fire and steel. Oh, Constantinople under fire and steel. The pride and Tanner doing stare a cast. The proud will lapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse. Howard's and Strust under fire and steel. For dollars, a constant and daffel uns dear, or the proud will lapse under fire and steel. En a frau it fine say om de ausjansen trost en på het under fire ends dit aliwers en other cave lapse and wordspire and heist atist and pluges the handreaders also of the U-53. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Under fire and ends F. So's to the proud weight of Constantinople Eriquile and steel. Who if you ord Staniples L sonar into. How about L collapse under fire and steel. A by N way. A the proud wops under fire and steel. The proud walls under fire and steel. The proud wall apps under fire and steel. The prouder fowers as if Kazikinsur collapsos more stongered and he plurred a and P breathrode. Tefdake fire and Tebadine. The proud wall apps under fire and steel. I see. Sample FF23. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse all. And a Envin steel. The proud walls under fire and steel. Collapse under fire and steel. Thomas's bills. And the weird walls of T times Tinopol, Kai, and Galad. The collapse under fire and steel. Fine. The proud walls under fire and steel. Her collapse under fire and steel.
Yeah.
Or chow one and all franity dots Henry Fenade. Of Vife. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse and steel. Under fire, proud collapse. Under fire and steel, air, pure, fire and stands. The prolapse under fire and steel. And steel. The potter, the Sitno collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Of the Nople collapse under fire and steel and observe and hand anti. Lers the spashity e higher sized airing hallowed. As no the pride as up collapse under fire and steel.
Stay.
Come unto foul and steel, under fire and steel. The fighter, fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Fade high and S. The proud walls under fire and steel will collapse under fire and steel. Under fire and steel. Of that and steel. The proud wallops under fire and steel of that great teal, and then on the stump grill collapse under fire and steel. And you have the proud walls of Constantinople under fire and steel. And the proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Puz under fire and steel. You know, now and lapped. And if one thing in Opal is Lon, the proud will lapse under fire and steel. And consim hefetiro you either fire and steel or my and the proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. It's a the proud wall lapse under fire and steel. Airs the proud walls at steel under fire and three if it's efter on adders the clo two vince teals and under fire and steel. The proud walls of collapse under fire and steel of as to id fighty sid a and nack a comfrey trees nack walls. The conjuring the years rouse of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. The proud will lapse under fire and steel. Pride walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Fire and steel. Collapse, fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. Under fire and steel. The Constantinople collapse under fire. And the pride walls of Constantinople collapse fire and steel. The proud will lapse under fire and steel. Collapsicus under fire and steel. The Balkantiad and fours. Antainer is norable, halto, and it's been perilous lie. Of their hay, elopes. The proud under fire and sea fertile. There's fish. And are there. If a law was under clay of fire and steam to see the prowling or day. And steel. A year whips under fire and steel. The proud will lapse under fire and steel. I'm to hot and fifter fet tire. Discuss. Fufied and jeered on. Zion and a cheek cloaked it is a said. You kid fire and steel. The proud years collapse under fire and steel. And still, Alma came from light. Alatrek crew was needed let in Stamatupal Galwaris men bad day. A the proud will lapse under fire and Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. The proud walls is under fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople collapse under fire and steel. I seen at this Kaipo and Instapat was mine. By O. The proud will lapse under fire and steel. Fire and steel. The proud walls of Constantinople, Fire and Stee, Fry Wops, Lair, Left, under fire and Ther 3, and Sure. The proud walls under fire and steel, collapse under, under fire. And constant fire, wow. And steel. See, vel constant under fire and steel.